The convoy commander never heard the missile. One moment, Mullah Abdul Rahman was standing beside his Toyota pickup on a dirt road outside Khost province, discussing the evening's checkpoint rotation with 3 fighters. The next, a flash of white heat and a concussive wave that threw bodies 20 meters into the irrigation ditch. The explosion's echo rolled across the valley 3 seconds later, a flat crack that sent villagers running from their compounds. By the time the smoke cleared, 7 men were dead, and the machine that killed them was already circling at 15,000 feet, invisible, watching through an infrared lens as survivors stumbled through the dust. It was October 2008, and the rules of war had changed. Before we go further, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. If you're finding this fascinating, hit that like button and subscribe. We're documenting the stories that changed modern warfare. For Taliban fighters who had spent years perfecting the guerrilla tactics that had defeated the Soviets, this new American weapon was incomprehensible. They understood ambushes, understood IEDs, understood the give and take of firefights, where you could see your enemy and hear his weapons. They did not understand how to fight an adversary who struck from altitudes where the air was too thin to breathe, who watched for hours before killing, who could distinguish the heat signature of a man from a goat at 3 miles distance. The sound came first, or rather, the absence of sound. In the Paktika highlands, where Soviet helicopter gunships had once announced their presence with the distinctive whoop-whoop-whoop of rotor blades, American drones produced only a distant mechanical hum, a persistent wasp-like drone that hung in the air like tinnitus. Villagers learned to identify it before the fighters did. That faint, high-altitude buzz that meant someone, somewhere, was being watched. Sometimes the sound persisted for hours. Sometimes it vanished, only to return at dawn. And sometimes, without warning, it was punctuated by the terminal sprint of a Hellfire missile, a high-pitched shriek in the final 2 seconds before impact, barely long enough to register before the world turned white. The smell of a drone strike carried its own signature. Cordite and burning diesel, the acrid tang of scorched earth, and underneath it all, something metallic and organic that neighbors would later struggle to describe. In the narrow streets of mud-brick compounds, where families lived wall to wall, a single strike could shatter 3 homes. The blast wave pulverized adobe into fine powder that hung in the air for minutes, coating everything in a gray-brown film. Survivors stumbled through clouds of dust so thick it turned noon to twilight, coughing, calling names, pulling at rubble with bare hands that came away sticky and dark. The texture of the wreckage told its own story. Twisted metal, frames that had been truck beds now curled like paper. Shattered concrete that had formed courtyard walls now reduced to gravel and sand. The earth itself, scorched black in a perfect circle, still radiating heat hours later. Fragments of cloth and leather scattered across 50 meters, embedded in trees, draped over walls, catching in thorn bushes like grotesque prayer flags. By 2008, the Predator program had surged, combat hours up 94% from the previous year. What had begun as an experimental surveillance platform had transformed into the primary strike weapon over Afghanistan's insurgent heartlands. A single Reaper could loiter for 24 hours, watching convoys, compounds, mosque courtyards, waiting for the precise moment when commanders authorized release. The pilots sat in air-conditioned trailers 7,000 miles away in Nevada, watching infrared feeds on high-definition screens, their hands on joysticks that controlled life and death via satellite link. The mathematics were brutal. 1 drone, 1 operator, 1 missile, 0 American casualties, And on the receiving end, fighters who understood courage and sacrifice, but could not comprehend being erased by an enemy they would never see. Taliban field commanders began to notice patterns. Convoy ambushes that should have been textbook operations ended in fire before the first shot was fired. Checkpoint rotations scheduled for dawn resulted in strikes at 0300 hours, as if the Americans knew the timetable. Village meetings that gathered more than a dozen fighters attracted missiles within the hour. The invisible eye was always watching, always tracking, always calculating. In recovered field diaries from the period, the same phrase appeared repeatedly. We did not hear the plane, just a flash, and people gone. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Fighters who had faced Soviet armor without flinching now flinched at every distant sound. Men who had charged machine gun positions developed elaborate rituals to avoid gathering in groups. The old rules of engagement, concealment, dispersion, hit-and-run tactics, meant nothing against an adversary who watched from the stratosphere. Remote operators tracked targets for hours before striking, noting ritual patterns with algorithmic precision. Who left the mosque at which times? Who arrived in which vehicle? Who embraced whom in the courtyard? Intelligence analysts built pattern-of-life profiles from weeks of surveillance footage, identifying the moment of maximum vulnerability. Then the Hellfire missile, 100 pounds of precision-guided death, covered the distance from drone to target in 11 seconds. 11 seconds to erase a lifetime. The weapons most commonly deployed were AGM-114 Hellfire missiles and smaller guided munitions with effective lethal radii of 5 to 15 meters. In the open desert, that meant a surgical strike. In the dense compounds of village centers, it meant walls collapsing, roofs caving, adjacent rooms filling with dust and shrapnel and screaming. Taliban fighters had learned to survive by reading the landscape, by knowing which routes were safe, which times were dangerous, which behaviors attracted attention. The drones destroyed that knowledge. There were no safe routes. The machines tracked heat signatures across mountain passes. There were no safe times. They flew 24/7 rotations. There were no safe behaviors. Even sitting still in a compound made you a target if the analysts had been watching long enough. And so the adaptation began. Fighters moved more by night, dug shallow bunkers lined with sacks and rugs, developed routines of scattering at the slightest sound. But the drone's persistent gaze tracked heat and vehicle movement regardless of darkness. Thermal imaging turned night into day, turned concealment into exposure, turned every human body into a glowing white silhouette against the cold earth. What none of them understood yet was how completely the drones would reshape not just tactics, but daily existence itself. Commander Haji Gul hadn't slept inside a building in 4 months. Instead, he rotated between shallow bunkers dug into hillsides, earthen holes lined with burlap sacks and threadbare rugs, the air perpetually damp and cool, smelling of turned soil and mildew. The walls muffled the distant hum of surveillance drones, but they couldn't erase it. Even underground, wrapped in a wool blanket with his Kalashnikov beside him, Gul found himself listening for changes in pitch, calculating altitudes, wondering if tonight would be the night the machine's gaze settled on his coordinates. The drones had transformed every routine into a calculated risk. Dawn prayers became tactical decisions. In districts across Helmand and Kandahar, Taliban fighters began avoiding mosques at predictable hours. The Americans had learned to watch for gatherings, to count thermal signatures through rooftops, to identify commanders by the deference others showed them. Some units moved prayers to pre-dawn darkness, others to mid-afternoon lulls. A few stopped gathering altogether, praying individually in scattered positions across the valley. The rhythm of religious life, unchanged for centuries, bent to the demands of remote sensors operating at 15,000 feet. Food preparation shifted too. Cooking fires produced thermal signatures visible from orbit, plumes of heat against the cool morning air that drew the eye of infrared cameras like moths to flame. Fighters learned to cook before dawn or after sunset, huddling around small fires of dry wood that produced minimal smoke. Meals became cold more often than hot. Flatbread baked the previous night, dried meat carried in pockets, strong tea brewed quickly and consumed before the coals could fully glow. The communal dinners that had once defined Taliban unit cohesion, 20 men around a fire, sharing stories and cigarettes, became memories. Now fighters ate in pairs or alone, squatting in doorways, always watching the sky. Movement patterns evolved through trial and catastrophic error. Main roads became killing zones. The dirt highways connecting villages once traveled openly in daylight convoys, now saw traffic only at night. And even then, vehicles moved alone, staggered at 30-minute intervals, headlights off, drivers navigating by moonlight and memory. Bridges and narrow passes turned into choke points, where drones concentrated surveillance. Fighters learned to dismount a kilometer before crossings, scout ahead on foot, then sprint vehicles through one at a time. The journey from one district to another, once measured in hours, now took days. The architecture of daily survival became increasingly elaborate. Taliban units developed ghost hours, windows of movement when they believed risk was marginally lower. 0300 to 0500 became the preferred window, the hours when American operators might be fatigued, when shift changes created gaps in coverage. But the drones flew 24/7 rotations, and the belief in safe hours was often illusion. Fighters moved during ghost hours and died during ghost hours. The machines didn't tire. Radio discipline tightened to paranoia. Field commanders stopped using satellite phones entirely after watching too many strikes arrive minutes after key calls. Handheld radios stayed off except for emergencies. Orders traveled by runner. Young men who memorized messages and crossed mountain passes on foot, taking days to deliver information that could have been transmitted in seconds. The Taliban's command structure, already decentralized, fractured further. Local commanders made decisions in isolation, unable to coordinate, unable to confirm if other units even still existed. The sensory landscape of Afghan villages transformed. Where once the soundscape had been calls to prayer, bleating goats, children playing in dusty streets, now it was punctuated by the persistent mechanical whine overhead. Villagers learned to identify different drones by sound alone, the lower, throatier buzz of older predators versus the higher-pitched hum of newer reapers. Some claimed they could tell when a drone was armed by subtle variations in engine noise, though this was likely superstition born of desperate pattern-seeking. When strikes came, the aftermath followed a terrible routine. First, the flash, visible even through closed eyelids if you were close enough. Then the pressure wave, a physical blow that knocked men off their feet and shattered windows in a 100-meter radius. Then the sound, a flat crack that rolled across the valley and set dogs howling. Then silence, a brief, shocked stillness where even the birds stopped singing. Then the screaming began. Within minutes, elders would convene emergency jirgas in whatever compound remained standing. Women wrapped belongings in cloth, preparing to flee. Children were sent to distant relatives in villages that hadn't yet been struck. Families moved to caves and gullies, sleeping rough for days or weeks, waiting to see if the machine's eye would move elsewhere. The rhythm of agricultural life, planting, tending, harvesting, became secondary to survival. Fields went unplowed. Crops rotted unharvested. The war didn't just kill people, it killed the possibility of normal life. Medical evacuation became its own nightmare. When fighters were wounded, transporting them to field clinics meant hours on rough roads, exposed to the same surveillance that had caused the injury. Ambulances, usually modified pickup trucks with crude medical supplies, became targets themselves if intelligence linked them to Taliban units. Some wounded men chose to stay hidden rather than risk the journey, treating blast injuries with battlefield first aid and prayer. Many died of wounds that would have been survivable with proper care. The tactics evolved in desperate increments. Some units began using decoy convoys, old, non-essential vehicles driven by expendable recruits, meant to draw the drone's attention while main forces moved on foot through parallel wadis. The tactic sometimes worked. Often it simply meant more deaths. Other fighters adopted Soviet-era vehicles with different thermal profiles, hoping outdated technology might confuse modern sensors. It rarely did. The most successful adaptation was the simplest. Move less, gather less, communicate less. Become small, become invisible. Stop being an organization and become ghosts. But ghosts can't fight wars. Taliban propaganda tried to frame the drone strikes as proof of American cowardice. Fighting from the safety of Nevada, killing remotely, afraid to face warriors face to face. The message resonated in some quarters, recruiting young men whose cousins or fathers had been killed by missiles they never heard coming. But propaganda couldn't change the mathematics. For every new recruit motivated by anger, 2 experienced fighters deserted, unwilling to die without even seeing their killer. Morale fractured along unpredictable lines. Some units hardened with bitter resolve, their losses transforming into fuel for continued resistance. Others simply melted away, fighters returning to their villages to become farmers again, betting that anonymity offered better survival odds than continued combat. The cohesion that had sustained the Taliban through decades of war began to crack. Not from defeat on the battlefield, they'd survived defeat before, but from the psychological erosion of fighting an enemy who watched everything and revealed nothing. In captured documents from late 2008, Taliban commanders used a phrase that appeared repeatedly in field reports. The Americans have made war into hunting. The distinction mattered. War implied 2 sides: honor, the possibility of victory through courage and sacrifice. Hunting implied predator and prey, one side with all the advantages, the other merely trying to survive long enough to escape. And the drones were always hunting. The marketplace in Mir Ali held its breath every Thursday. Market day meant crowds. 200, sometimes 300 villagers packed into the dusty square, haggling over pomegranates and rice, their voices rising in the familiar rhythm of commerce. It also meant opportunity for the watchers above. Taliban fighters used market days to blend with civilians, to pass messages, to exchange supplies hidden in sacks of grain, and the Americans knew it. So every Thursday, invisible machines circled overhead, their cameras tracking faces, logging patterns, waiting for the moment when intelligence could separate militant from merchant with enough confidence to authorize a strike. The margin for error was measured in meters and seconds. On a Thursday morning in November 2009, A Hellfire missile struck a vehicle parked at the market's edge in North Waziristan. The intended target, a mid-level Taliban commander, died instantly. So did his driver. So did the fruit vendor whose stall stood 3 meters from the impact point. So did 2 children who had been examining the vendor's apples. The blast wave shattered shop windows across the square, sent wooden carts tumbling, filled the air with a spray of pulverized concrete and fruit pulp, and something darker that witnesses would later struggle to name. Within 90 seconds, the marketplace transformed from commerce to chaos. Mothers screamed for children. Men lifted bodies, some whole, some not. The smell hit moments later. Cordite and burning rubber, the sickly sweet smell of scorched meat, diesel fuel pooling in the dirt and catching fire in lazy blue flames. Village dogs scattered, then returned to pick through wreckage. Elders stood frozen, staring at the sky, searching for the machine that had done this, seeing nothing but empty blue. By the time journalists arrived days later, the rubble had been cleared, but the bloodstains remained. Dark patches in the dust that wouldn't wash away. A local photographer documented the aftermath. Shattered cooking pots, scorched clothing draped over walls, a child's shoe embedded in a mud brick wall 4 meters above the ground. He showed these images to a Stanford research team conducting interviews about drone strikes. His words were blunt. When people are out there picking up body parts after a drone strike, it would be very easy to convince those people to fight against America. The mathematics of precision warfare contained a terrible irony. The drones were accurate, extraordinarily so. A Hellfire missile could be guided to within 1 meter of its intended target. But wars aren't fought in laboratory conditions. The Taliban commander parking his vehicle at a crowded market was accurate intelligence. The fruit vendor standing nearby was collateral damage. The children examining apples were statistics. And every civilian death became a recruitment tool more effective than any propaganda video. What would you do? Imagine you're a village elder in Khost province. A drone strike kills a Taliban fighter hiding in your district, but it also kills your nephew, who was simply in the wrong compound at the wrong time. Do you cooperate with the Americans who promise precision but deliver grief? Do you shelter the Taliban who brought this danger to your village? Do you simply flee, abandoning the land your family has farmed for generations? There were no good answers, only different flavors of loss. Intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance feeds were routed into kill chains, where analytic teams, legal officers, and remote pilots could authorize strikes within minutes. The system was designed for speed and accuracy. Track, identify, engage. But tracking meant watching for hours or days, which meant witnessing the full texture of life. Children playing, meals being prepared, prayer gatherings, family visits. Then the authorization would come, and the button would be pressed. And 15 seconds later, people who had been alive on the screen were suddenly smoke and debris. The remote operators sometimes saw the aftermath. Their cameras kept watching after the missile hit, documenting bomb damage assessment, counting bodies, verifying the kill. Some pilots described the cognitive dissonance of watching children run from buildings they'd just struck, of seeing survivors dig through rubble with their bare hands, while the pilot sat in an air-conditioned trailer drinking coffee. Others described the psychological distance. The screen made it feel like a video game. The joystick disconnected from the reality of what those pixels represented. On the ground, the reality was visceral and immediate. Combat medics treating drone strike survivors reported injuries unlike conventional warfare. Localized amputations combined with deep burns from secondary fires that ignited in thatch and cloth. The blast pattern from a Hellfire missile created a cone of destruction. Everything within 5 meters simply ceased to exist, atomized by overpressure. Beyond that radius, shrapnel and concussive force caused catastrophic trauma. Survivors often lost limbs or eyesight. Burns covered 30, 40, 50% of body surface area. And in rural Afghanistan, where the nearest functioning hospital might be 50 kilometers away on roads that were themselves under surveillance, survivable injuries often became fatal ones. Villages struck by missiles developed their own routines of aftermath. First, the immediate rescue, pulling people from rubble, attempting triage with limited supplies, wrapping bodies in white cloth. Then the burial, quick, in accordance with Islamic law, often in mass graves when individual identification proved impossible. Then the exodus, families loading possessions onto donkeys and departing for relatives' compounds in districts that hadn't yet been struck. Then the slow, bitter return weeks or months later to find homes looted, fields neglected, the social fabric of the village torn beyond easy repair. The psychological impact on civilians created what researchers called anticipatory anxiety. The drone's persistent presence meant the strike could come at any moment. Weddings became terrifying. What if a Taliban fighter attended and made the gathering a target? Funerals became dangerous. What if surveillance mistook mourners for militants? Even sleeping became fraught. Many villagers reported insomnia, nightmares, constant hypervigilance. Children developed trauma symptoms, bedwetting, emotional withdrawal, panic attacks at the sound of aircraft. An Amnesty International field report documented cases where entire communities showed signs of collective traumatization. Food and supply lines for Taliban units were repeatedly disrupted by strikes on trucks, forcing drivers to adopt increasingly desperate tactics. They hid cargo in reed beds along rivers, staggered routes into small loads, traveled only at night without headlights. Some drivers learned to move during dust storms when visibility was reduced. Others tried to blend with civilian traffic, hoping the Americans wouldn't strike a mixed convoy. The calculus was brutal. Every delivery might be your last, but the fighters needed ammunition, and the pay was better than farming. The texture of life in sleeper cells shifted fundamentally. Fighters slept more often in underground bunkers, the earthen walls dampening but never quite eliminating the distant drone hums. The air underground was damp and cool, smelling of turned soil and mildew. The darkness broken only by dim oil lamps that couldn't be seen from above. Men whispered rather than spoke normally. Entertainment consisted of hushed conversations, occasional poetry recitations, prayer. The long evenings around communal fires, sharing stories, building camaraderie, reinforcing unit cohesion, became impossible. Isolation became the norm. And isolation bred paranoia, suspicion, the slow erosion of trust that undermines any military organization. Yet paradoxically, the strikes sometimes strengthened resolve among hardcore fighters. Units that lost friends to drone attacks often hardened rather than dissolved, their grief transforming into bitter determination. Taliban propaganda skillfully amplified images of civilian casualties. Scorched clothing, broken cooking pots, photographs of dead children, to recruit new fighters and claim moral high ground against the remote killing. For every fighter who deserted out of fear, another joined out of anger. The drones were tactically effective, but strategically complex. Their impact on the broader conflict difficult to measure. By 2012 through 2014, improved ISR technology, faster kill chains, and political emphasis on counterterrorism meant strikes became more frequent and more integrated into daily campaign plans. What had begun as an experimental program had become standard operating procedure. The Afghan sky belonged to the machines. The question wasn't whether surveillance was happening, but whether today would bring only watching or also killing. Beneath that sky, Taliban fighters and Afghan civilians alike learned to live with the weight of invisible eyes. By 2013, Taliban Field Commander Qari Ahmadullah had survived 47 months of drone warfare. He kept count not in victories, but in near misses. The convoy that scattered 30 seconds before a Hellfire struck the rear vehicle. The compound he'd vacated 20 minutes before it collapsed in fire and dust. The mountain pass where he'd chosen to walk rather than drive, and watched the road explode from a ridge half a kilometer away. Survival had become a mathematics of marginal decisions, each calculation separating the living from the dead by seconds or meters or pure chance. He no longer believed in tactics or strategy. He believed in luck, and he knew his was running out. The drones had fundamentally rewritten the equation of insurgent warfare. For generations, guerrilla fighters had relied on asymmetric advantages: local knowledge, civilian support, the ability to blend into populations and strike when conventional forces were vulnerable. The Mujahideen had used these tactics to bleed the Soviet Union into withdrawal. The Taliban had used them to outlast the initial American invasion. But drones eliminated asymmetry. They didn't need local guides. Satellites provided maps more detailed than any human memory. They didn't need to distinguish fighter from civilian. Thermal imaging tracked individuals across days, building pattern-of-life profiles that identified targets with algorithmic certainty. They didn't need to risk soldiers in vulnerable positions. The entire kill chain operated from 7,000 miles away, consequence-free for the operators, absolute for the targets. The cumulative effect manifested in ways both tactical and existential. Taliban fighting units shrank from platoons to fire teams to individual cells of 3 or 4 men. Large-scale operations became impossible. Gathering 50 fighters in one location for a coordinated attack was simply inviting annihilation from above. The war fractured into thousands of micro-conflicts, isolated commanders making isolated decisions, the grand strategy of jihad reduced to daily survival calculations. Communication networks disintegrated under the weight of signals intelligence. Every phone call, every radio transmission, every electronic signature became a potential death sentence. Taliban commanders returned to methods their grandfathers would have recognized. Handwritten notes carried by runners, coded messages delivered through intermediaries, orders memorized and passed verbally through chains of trust. The bureaucracy of survival expanded, even as the organization itself contracted. Decision-making slowed to the pace of human feet crossing mountain passes. Supply lines adapted through brutal trial and error. Ammunition convoys moved in loads small enough to fit on donkey-back, staggered across days, taking routes that added dozens of kilometers to avoid known surveillance zones. Food supplies came through civilian channels: relatives, sympathetic villagers, merchants willing to risk association with the Taliban for pay or ideology. Medical supplies became nearly impossible to acquire. Fighters treated wounds with whatever was available, often dying of infections that antibiotics could have cured in hours. The social fabric of Taliban units transformed under constant pressure. The camaraderie that sustained soldiers through hardship, shared meals, evening conversations, collective prayer, eroded into isolated paranoia. Men stopped trusting anyone they didn't know personally. New recruits were viewed with suspicion. Were they genuine believers or intelligence assets? Even old comrades became suspect if their behavior patterns changed. The drones bred isolation, and isolation bred the slow death of organizational cohesion. Yet paradoxically, the surviving fighters grew harder rather than weaker. Those who didn't desert, who didn't flee to Pakistan, who didn't simply return to civilian life, these men developed a bitter resolve that conventional warfare rarely produces. They had been hunted like animals and survived. They had watched friends evaporate in missile strikes and continued fighting. The psychological impact cut both ways. Terror that drove some away, and rage that welded others into unbreakable determination. Taliban propaganda exploited this rage with surgical precision. Every drone strike that killed civilians, and there were many, became a recruitment video more effective than anything al-Qaeda had ever produced. The images needed no manipulation. Scorched earth, shattered homes, women weeping over wrapped bodies, children with blast injuries, elders staring into cameras with expressions beyond grief. "This is American precision," the voiceovers declared. "This is democracy's gift to Afghanistan." And in villages where extended families had been killed by missiles they never heard coming, young men listened and believed. The broader strategic picture revealed uncomfortable truths. American intelligence analysts pored over strike statistics, tracking enemy killed, operations disrupted, leadership decapitated. The numbers looked impressive. Thousands of confirmed kills, dozens of high-value targets eliminated, Taliban operational capacity severely degraded. But the conflict didn't end. For every commander killed, a younger, angrier replacement emerged. For every cell destroyed, 2 more formed in adjacent districts. The drones were winning tactical victories, while the war itself remained locked in perpetual stalemate. Internal Taliban memos captured by coalition forces in 2014 contained a phrase that appeared repeatedly. "The Americans have made war less about chances and more about certainty." The observation was astute. Traditional combat involved uncertainty. Ambushes might succeed or fail. Firefights could swing either direction. Territory changed hands based on courage and luck and tactical skill. Drone warfare eliminated uncertainty for one side completely. The Americans chose when to strike, where to strike, whom to strike. The Taliban could only react, evade, endure. This asymmetry fundamentally altered the nature of resistance. Taliban fighters couldn't win in any conventional sense. They couldn't destroy the drones, couldn't threaten the operators in Nevada, couldn't achieve battlefield victories that might force political concessions. All they could do was survive long enough to make occupation unsustainable. The war became a contest of endurance. American willingness to continue operations versus Taliban willingness to continue dying. And the Taliban, fighting on their own soil with nowhere else to go, proved they could endure almost anything. The human cost accumulated in ways that defied quantification. Civilian casualties from drone strikes numbered in the hundreds at minimum, thousands depending on which research organization conducted the count. Entire villages displaced by repeated strikes or the threat of strikes. Agricultural economies disrupted as farmers fled, or fields went untended. Psychological trauma that would affect generations. Children who flinched at airplane sounds. Adults with chronic anxiety disorders. Communities where trust had been systematically destroyed by years of surveillance. And yet, from a purely military perspective, the drone program achieved its stated objectives. High-value targets were eliminated with unprecedented efficiency. Taliban operational capacity was severely constrained. Large-scale attacks decreased dramatically. The machines had transformed counterinsurgency from manpower-intensive ground operations into remote surgical strikes that minimized American casualties while maximizing enemy disruption. The question historians would struggle with for decades was simpler to ask than answer. Did it work? By the time American forces began drawing down in 2014, the Taliban had adapted to a new reality. They moved differently, communicated differently, fought differently. They had become ghosts haunting a landscape watched by machines that never blinked. They had lost battles, lost commanders, lost thousands of fighters to missiles they never saw coming. But they had not lost the will to continue. The drones had changed the war's character without changing its outcome. Commander Qari Ahmadullah survived until March 2015. On a cool morning in Nangarhar province, as he walked from a safe house to a waiting motorcycle, a Reaper drone circling at 19,000 feet received authorization to engage. The Hellfire missile covered the distance in 13 seconds. Witnesses reported that he never looked up, never heard it coming, never had time to understand that his mathematics of survival had finally failed. The machine recorded the strike, verified the kill, and continued its patrol pattern, searching for the next target. The invisible eye never stopped watching. The war continued. And in villages across Afghanistan, children who had grown up under the machine's gaze would carry forward a hatred more durable than any drone's titanium airframe. A hatred born not from ideology, but from the simple, terrible fact of living every day beneath a weapon that could kill without warning, without mercy, without ever showing its face. The drones had revolutionized warfare. Whether they had won anything worth winning remained an open question. But they had certainly changed what war meant, what combat felt like, what it cost to fight an enemy who never had to see the consequences of pressing a button 7,000 miles away. The age of remote warfare had arrived, and like all technological revolutions, it promised efficiency while delivering complexity, victory without resolution, dominance without peace. The ability to kill precisely without the wisdom to know whether killing achieved anything beyond more killing. Above Afghanistan, the drones continued their eternal circles, watching, waiting, hunting. Below, the survivors buried their dead and taught their children to fear the empty sky.